Today is September 13th, 2022. I am with Ruth Strauss, Ruthstrauss. I'm Sandra Scheller, Sandrascheller. We are in Encinitas, California, United States of America.
Nice start.
Anytime. I need to ask you, what is your name?
Ruth Brunel Strauss, and I was born in Berlin, Germany on October 12, 1931.
Would you be so kind and spell your name for me?
Strauss.
That is your married last name?
Yes.
Your maiden name was?
Brunell.
And your first name?
Ruth.
Ruth. You live now in?
In Seacrest and Encinitas, and I've lived here for 11 years. Very happy.
Where were you born, as you said earlier?
Berlin, Germany.
And can you spell Berlin for me?
Berlin.
And Germany?
Germany.
And you were born on what day?
October 12, 1931.
So growing up, I'd like to know, how far back can you remember? What's the earliest memory you can remember in Berlin?
Most of my memories are the stories that my mother would tell me. I remember very little. Like my daughter asked me, didn't you notice that the behavior of your parents changed during that time? And frankly, I did not. I do very vaguely remember that on Kristallnacht, when I came home after seeing all the glass, I asked my mother what had happened, and she said it was very windy last night, and I took that as a plausible answer and never questioned it anymore. A feeling that I've never been able to really express was that I was aware that I was changed from one school to another, and in the only 2 short years that I went to school in Germany, I must have been in 3 or 4 different schools. And as I found out later on, is because I was expelled from each of them for being Jewish.
What day did you remember, if you can, this windy day? When was this windy day that you can remember?
The date I don't know, and the day per se not either, and I don't even remember how I came home from the school to where I lived. I don't know if a car picked me up. I don't think we had school buses, so I really don't.
Was it cold? Was it warm? What do you remember about that day that you were walking?
Maybe it was cold. I'm more sensitive to cold than to warm.
Did you notice things on the ground that were unusual?
No.
Then how did you know it was a windy day?
I didn't until my mother told me.
Did you ask about what this glass was?
Yes.
Can you explain a little bit more to me?
Well, I just saw a lot of broken glass, and all she said was that it had been very windy, and that's why the glass was on the street.
Did you notice any writing on the windows?
No.
Did you notice people? Was there nobody on the street? What do you
Nobody
remember?
that I recollect, no.
So from the time you were born in, let's say, 1931 to the time of this happening, you were 7 years old, 8 years old, right around then. Can you remember earlier, like if I were to come to your home, what would it be like? Would there be Shabbos on a Friday? Tell me about how early you can remember.
One of the memories I have is my grandmother, my mother's mother, lived in Stuttgart, and we would go at least twice a year to visit her. And when we came back, my father would take out a ladder that we must have had in the apartment, which he put against the wall, and he would put all my dolls on it, and there would always be a new one when we came back. And that is a childhood memory. Plus, once for Hanukkah, when I got a little buggy for the doll to take her walking. That I do remember.
So you remember playing with dolls?
Yeah, some.
Or looking at them?
Yeah.
And tell me, who was the cook in the family? What do you remember as far as how you ate and things that you ate?
Well, if you want to know one story, breakfast, my mother was usually still in bed. I would always have it with my father, who always had a soft-boiled egg. And he used to play a game with me. When he cut open the egg, the eggshell on top was the train, a smaller one was a taxi, and smaller little bits were we getting into the taxi on the train to visit the grandmother. And once I had to go to the bathroom, and when I came back, the two bigger pieces were gone and the little piece was there. And I started crying. They left me and kept me. And that I remember.
Wow.
That's a story that my grandchildren all know.
They know about this?
Yes, yes.
Amazing. And any earlier, like who put you to bed at night? Did you share a room? Tell me.
No, I had my own bedroom. Funnily enough, I remember the apartment in Berlin quite well.
Tell me that.
And there was Agnes, who I think was the cook and also the maid. And I don't remember the day per se, but I was aware that at one point she was gone, and asked my mother, and my mother said she had to visit her family. Obviously, that must have been in 1938 and had to do with the Nuremberg laws. So there was no Agnes anymore. But
did you love Agnes?
I liked her. I won't say loved her.
And did you notice after 1938, that things were changing?
I always think that I wasn't aware of anything. However, I must have been, because I had a little blonde friend who lived across the street from me, and she and I would always play Auswanderung, emigrating. And we would take our dolls and go from embassy to try and get a visa. Of course, I had no clue what a visa was or what it meant. And then, once we got it, or were going to get it, we went with the dolls to doctors to get certificates that we were healthy. And that was a game that my mother, I don't remember it, but my mother told me I used to play with a little girl across the street every time we were together. So obviously I must have known something.
Do you remember her name?
No, no. Unfortunately,
Did your
not.
mother talk to her mother?
I wouldn't know.
It was just the two of you getting together?
And playing, yes.
Did she play in your house or did you play in her house?
I'm not sure. I think in my house, but it might have been in her house. I'm not sure.
Mm-hmm. And then 1938, November, December,
Well,
holiday.
what I do remember, my father, one of his best customers, was in England. And he invited my dad at about 38 that time to come to London because he wanted him as a partner to build a factory so my dad could continue doing what he was doing in Berlin. He was supposed to be gone for 2 months, but after 2 weeks he came back. He had asthma and couldn't stand the climate in London. So he said, I'll never be able to move there. And just about that time, I vaguely remember that the movers came and packed everything that was in the apartment, all the photo albums, everything in crates, and off they went, apparently to England, where my mother later on found out they were bombed by the Germans. And after that, of course, we lived in a furnished apartment. And in 1936, my uncle Eric, whom I hope to be able and mention many times, and I hope his story will be told because it's very meaningful. He came to visit because my grandmother had passed away, and he told his 2 brothers and sister, he was living in Mexico, they were in Germany, don't you see the writing on the wall? You must leave. And how I wish we had, but none of us did.
Did you feel it as a child? Did you feel any of the...
No, no. My parents super protected me, and no, in all honesty, I can't say that I felt it.
Are you an only child?
Yes. And that I don't know if the word suffered is correct, but I minded. I always wanted a sibling, which obviously I never got. Later on, I was told, yes, one of the reasons was Hitler. My dad would have loved to have a big family, which never happened.
Was your mother and father close?
Yes, yes.
Did you ever feel afraid when you went to sleep at night?
No. Fortunately not.
So they were really good at keeping things pretty quiet.
Yes.
And your father seemed to have a very interesting business. Can you explain, and would you tell me your father's name?
August Brunel. And
I'm going to let you spell that for me. It's just like the month, August.
Yes, and Brunel is Brunell.
Tell me about this wonderful man.
He told me that at one point my grandparents talked about their will or whatever, they would inherit in time to be. And my father said, No, I don't want anything then. I want a certain amount of money now if you're able to give it to me, which they were. And with that money, he moved to Berlin. He had been, excuse me, living in Cologne with his parents. He moved to Berlin and started this factory where he made, with mosaics and wrought iron, things that are in vogue now, and also figures out of bronze and other things. I never did see the factory.
Did you see the figures and things that your father made?
I had one sculpture that he made, which my daughter has now.
What does it look like?
It's a ballerina on one toe in that pose.
Stop. So your father gives you a ballerina. Did you do ballet?
Never.
Did you like the ballerina?
I really only appreciated her when we came to Mexico. I was never aware of it before.
And what happened with your father? He goes to England. You think he's going to be gone for 2 months. He comes back in 2 weeks. Tell me what happened.
No, he said he just wouldn't be able to live there under that climate. And then the movers came. I don't know if that had been anticipated or, it was obvious we weren't going to London, so maybe that had been done ahead of time, but everything was packed, and there was this empty apartment where we couldn't stay, so we must have rented a furnished apartment. And vaguely I remember that it might have been more than one, that there were several different places that we lived until we finally were able to leave, which was October 5th in 1940, and very, very grateful that we were lucky to leave that late, but got out.
What did you leave behind?
Of personal things? Nothing that I'm really aware of. What I do remember my mother telling me, and somehow it must have been written down, that when we left with 17 suitcases, and that I had clothes for the next 2 years while I was growing up. So we wouldn't have to buy any in Mexico because we wouldn't have money there. Also, we never tried to come to the States. It was always Mexico, and it was always through this Uncle Eric Brunel, my father's brother, who helped many Jewish people without visas to get off the ships. He was quite a man.
Tell me about Eric. Was he younger or older?
Older. He was the oldest one, then a sister, then my father, then a younger brother who left 2 months before we did, also through the visa, or better, the arrangements that Uncle Eric was able to make, also to Mexico.
Was Eric married?
Oh, yes, to a Mexican woman. And I had, when we arrived in Mexico, I had 2 cousins, a boy who was 6 years younger than I am, and a girl who is 8 years younger than I am. Both are alive. I'm in contact with them. They live in Monterrey, Mexico. And then he had 2 more children. And Um, so we left. Do you want to hear what I remember about the trip?
Of course.
Or it's still about Germany, things that I remember from either.
The one question I have before
Yes.
I forget, Ruth, is did your grandmother go with you?
No, my grandmother lived in Stuttgart with my aunt, and they emigrated to New York in 38 or 39.
But you remember something that your grandmother did with for your dolls, correct?
That was my aunt.
That was your
the
aunt.
wife of my father's younger brother.
Okay, it was the
And
aunt.
we lived together in Mexico City in order to save money. So we lived in the same apartment. She and my uncle never had children, and she loved me, you know, like her daughter, and would make exact copies of the dresses I had for my doll. That famous doll is now with my great-grandchildren in Chicago.
When you came to Mexico and your grandmother went to New York, did you ever see your grandmother again?
Yes. I went to New York in 1948 during a school holiday, and she came before that once to visit us in Mexico.
So now you're on a ship.
First, we flew from Berlin to Moscow.
Thank you.
We were supposed to be there overnight, but because all the trains were requisitioned for the soldiers, we had to spend 3 nights in this hotel in Moscow. And of course, we had no money on us as the trip had been prepaid. So my mother went to the agency to change the travel papers on the train from whatever category it was to a lower one to have money to pay for the extra nights at the hotel. And there were a few rubles left, and she wasn't going to just leave them there. So I remember mornings we went touring, and one thing I do remember very well is the metro in Moscow, marble and huge clocks. But in the afternoon, we went from furrier to furrier until my mother found some foxes to spend the 74 rubles on. And then we took the train from Moscow, the Trans-Siberian train. I think it was 11 days in a compartment that we shared with a very nice couple. My parents became quite friendly with them. Oh, and I had my 9th birthday on the train. We left Berlin on the 5th, but on the 12th of October we were on the train, and my dad had brought all sorts of little presents, and as usual made me a nice birthday table on the tray, which I vaguely remember. And I remember them telling me that they wouldn't eat the fruit, that they saved the fruit on the train for me because the food wasn't edible. The only thing edible was the fruit, so they wouldn't have it, so I could have it. So they would let us out at some of the stations just to walk a bit, stretch our legs, and we went through Harbin and eventually ended in Vladivostok. Someplace along the way, I have no idea where. My father had a business acquaintance, and I think they saw them. I don't know if before taking the ship or what, but anyway, we took a Japanese ship from Vladivostok, as I remember, and went to Manzanillo, Mexico. We stopped in Hawaii, we stopped in San Francisco. I know because my mother's best friend lived in San Francisco at the time and came to the pier. Of course, we couldn't get off, but they were shouting to each other. And then when we arrived in Manzanillo, famous Uncle Eric spoke to the port doctor and said, you see, here I have this permit. My brother isn't well, so he has to get off, and his wife and daughter as well. And that's how we got off the ship, November 18th, 1940. And he, I think, had driven to Manzanillo. So we drove back to Mexico City with him in the car. And once in Mexico City, we were in a sort of pension, which I don't really remember. But my uncle told my parents in order to make it easier for them, it would be a good idea if I were to move with him and his family to Monterrey while they got settled.
Stop.
Thank you.
So you're living with Uncle Eric and
In Monterrey, Mexico.
And did he speak German to you, or was it all in Spanish?
He spoke German to me, but he would leave in the morning, go to work, and nobody would speak German there. My cousins, they were younger than I am, so Spanish, which I learned very quickly. The older cousin would point to the ceiling and say, techo, pared, cuadro, etc. But I picked up Spanish very quickly.
Tell me something that you wanted to tell me about your mother in Germany.
What I forgot to mention is she, before we left, took a course in electrolysis, manicure, and pedicure, because she figured once when we got to Mexico, if she needed to work and earn a living, she might be able to do that. And strangely enough, the first months in Mexico, she was the one who earned money, and my father had a very, very hard time learning the language, and obviously he wasn't able to do what he used to do in Mexico. So even though my mother thought this was wasted time in Germany, it came in very handy. And, you know, it was by word of mouth. Funnily enough, she met one lady who had two sisters. They had lived in Stuttgart, and she met one of them, and then, of course, the word got around, and that's how she built up a clientele. In fact, her bedroom she changed into a sort of room where she had her little electrolysis apparatus and would do if the patients came to her. If she went to visit the people, she would walk so as not to pay the 10, 20 cents of the bus fare. And once when I was walking with her and we passed the beggar, and my mother didn't give him anything, and I sort of elbowed her and said, why don't you give him something? My mother said, he probably has more money than we do. So I really wasn't aware.
Wow. Eventually, did your father find good work?
Eventually, my father started like a middleman, getting jewelry from a major distributor or manufacturer and going to different jewelry stores, selling it. And the first year that the business started going a little bit, eventually he started importing jewelry from the United States. And the first year that there was a bit of a profit, he was diagnosed with cancer and died 5 months later. That was March 5th, 1945. And at the time, my mother, I guess we were walking in the hospital or we were at home, sat me down and told me, Ruth, I need to have a serious talk with you. I don't know if we'll have enough money that you can continue and finish high school, or you might have to come and help me in the office. And I understood and said, of course. Fortunately, she turned out to be a very good and savvy businesswoman, and the business that my dad had started, she built up, and I was able to finish high school.
And what was the business? Was it the art, the sculpture?
No. It was mainly the import jewelry from the States.
So he never...
Jewelry and compacts and things like that.
So he never continued the fabrication of the metal?
No, never. And the first business, my mother and my Aunt Margot, the wife of
Eric?
the
the
younger brother. I think it was one of the clients my mother had for the manicure, told her, you have such beautiful clothes. If you have any evening gowns, you can go as an extra to be filmed, and you get 50 pesos a day, which was a small fortune. So my aunt and my mother traveled like 2 hours by streetcar and buses to go to where they were filming, which was in the south of the city, and they got job as extras, and which, in fact, there is, Cantinflas was a very well-known actor. There is a scene where it wasn't planned, it happened, where he bumped into my Aunt Margot and said, excuse me, I thought you were Margot, which apparently was a funny saying in Spanish, which obviously she had no clue, but when she heard her name, she made such a amazed face that they kept that in the film. I saw that once or twice, many, many years ago.
What was the name of the film?
Something with Cantinflas. I don't know the name, unfortunately. So that was their first career, which didn't help my aunt very much under the bright lights because she had tuberculosis, which, yeah.
And how is the aunt that was married to
Uncle Eric?
Uh-huh.
Strict. And she would always call me a tomboy, because I was. And she had beautiful curly hair, which I always admired. And she said, if you want curly hair, you have to eat a lot of chile. I had no clue that Chile is, very hot. So I did bite into a Chile once, and for the rest of the day, I was under the water faucet drinking water. So she had a sense of humor.
Was she jealous about being not in the films? Did she go over to the film? Like, did she join?
Oh no, the aunt I'm talking about now is the wife of Uncle Eric and Aunt Ray. Once I was in Monterey living with them. The aunt that was in the film was the younger aunt, the wife of the younger brother. The aunt in Monterey is the wife of Uncle Eric, who was the oldest.
And now you lived with Uncle Eric and the aunt from Mexico.
Yes,
Did
the
you
Lola for 8 months.
And did you eventually go back to your mother? And
Oh yes, and during that time my mother was able to come once to visit me, and that was a big highlight. And thinking back, I don't remember if I felt it at the time or not, but thinking back, it must have been difficult, not only because of the language, the fact that here we had left Germany 3 months before or whatever, and now I was in a completely different surrounding without my parents, and at the beginning, without being able to speak the language.
but you're learning Spanish.
I learned Spanish. In fact, I went to a school there for a few months. I got on very well with my cousin. My cousin Anita, the girl, she was very jealous of me because she had been her father's favorite. And when I was there, I played a role too. So she was jealous, but we're on very good terms now and talk at least once a week. They still live in Monterey, Mexico.
When did you start realizing why you were no longer in Germany?
I couldn't tell you an exact date.
Not the exact, but when did you start to realize what you say in your teens? Did you start asking your mother questions like, Mom, how could we be in Germany and now we're here? Did you question any of the decisions that were made?
No, I never questioned them. In the background, when I played with my friend going to get a visa, etc., by then I didn't exactly know, but knew we had to leave Germany. And what I also have present is that during the whole trip, especially once we were on the ship, my mother was very nervous. Maybe she didn't express it, maybe I felt it, but obviously she was on pins and needles until we got to Mexico and got off to know if Uncle Eric would be there and would be able to get us off the ship, which fortunately happened.
Did you continue, you were born Jewish. Did Uncle Eric and the family continue anything with their Judaism?
No. My aunt was a good Catholic. My cousins are good Catholics. They're aware of the fact that their father was Jewish, but no, really not.
Do you remember lighting Shabbos candles, going
No,
to synagogue,
no.
going to Yom Kippur, Rosh
In
Hashanah?
Monterey, not at all. But the funny thing is that in Monterey, there are many, probably Sephardic Jews that light candles every Friday night and have no clue why they do. They're all great-great-great-grandchildren from Jews that settled in Monterey.
Following tradition.
Yes, yes.
So you're growing up. Are you meeting new friends? Is it just the family that you're close to? Do you
In
remember?
Monterey, it was mainly the family. Then 8 months later, I came back to Mexico. We lived in a small apartment. By then, my mother and father didn't share the apartment with my uncle and aunt. They each had enough money to each be able to pay the rent for their own apartment. I hardly remember that apartment, but we lived there for a number of years. I started going to a public school, which I liked. I felt different, not so much because of being Jewish, but because I was whiter. I wasn't the Mexican child. Private schools in Mexico were very reasonable, not like here in the States where they're very expensive. So after, I think, 2 years, my parents changed me to a private school, which turned out not to be very good, but that's where I met my 2 best friends that were friends. One of them passed away a year ago, the other one 15 years ago, but we were very, very close all throughout our life, with the husbands as well. So,
What things kept you busy? Did you have any hobbies? Did you listen to music? Did you dance? Did you play any instruments?
never did. I always wished I would have been able to play the piano. We played pick-up sticks and marbles and card games, and there was one Jewish family that lived very near the second apartment we got in Mexico, and they left for Israel as soon as Israel became Israel in 1948. And a lot of the Judaism that I'm aware of from before was through them, Ruth and Judith Mishael. And I tried to, find them. Unfortunately, I never have been able to. But I don't remember if they kept kosher, but on Saturday, Michael was no, I'm not sure. Anyway, he would take his lawn chair. They lived across the park, and Saturday afternoon, he was always in the park reading, whether the Torah or something else. I don't know, but that's where I learned most of the Judaism I knew at the time. And I went roller skating with them, etc. And there, some years later, we joined a small Jewish temple, and it wasn't the synagogue, it was a rented room that we did go for Yom Kippur and Rosh Hashanah. So that I know even in Mexico we had not much to do, no special meals, but we did go to services.
When you learned about why you left, here you're this young girl, you're told it's a windy day instead of the definition of Kristallnacht. Your father goes, comes back, then all of a sudden you're on this train and you realize that your life is changing. What do you think now? When you look at things now, what's your perspective? Let's say that you're going to talk to your children, you're going to talk to your grandchildren, you're going to talk to your great-grandchildren. What do you tell them when it comes to picking up and starting over because somebody doesn't like your religion or who you are as a person?
I wouldn't say that they don't like me as a person. I would emphasize more the religious part and make them aware that unfortunately we as Jews have always been the scapegoat. Is that the proper word? Mm-hmm. And God forbid it could happen again. And that my parents and I were very fortunate in being able to live. And I continue my life, and I had my father a few more years, my mother more years, and eventually met my husband and was able to have a good and happy life here.
Do you ever think about if you stayed in Germany, what would have happened?
Under the circumstances there or under normal circumstances? Well, what would have happened is...
What do you want your children and grandchildren to know what would have happened if you would have stayed there? What do you think?
We would have ended out in Auschwitz, I'm sure. What's more, my father had a sweet tooth, and where his office was, he would cross the street and go for coffee and a little pastry every afternoon. Obviously, the owner of this conditorei knew him very well, and at one point told him, "Don't come for the next few days, because I heard the Gestapo is going to comb this area, so don't appear, stay home," which he did. And later on, he found out, yes, several of his friends were caught by the police and were not taken to Auschwitz, but to prison, and God knows what happened later on.
Do you remember seeing fighting in the street? Do you remember gunshots, sounds, airplanes?
No. What I do remember, once we were in these apartments, furnished apartments, whenever there was a siren to go down to the cellar, my mother never wanted to go. She said, if a bomb is going to hit this building, the same thing will happen here as down there. She was comfortable in bed and wouldn't want to go out. And I always said, no, we have to go. And in fact, at one point, I even told them, we have these are papers for Uncle Fritz, the younger one, so we have to go down because, God forbid, something happens to us, he won't be able to leave either. Of course, I had a much better time downstairs because there were some kids, you know.
Tell me what the cellar is like.
It wasn't the cellar, it was just the basement of this apartment building.
And what, did it have a door? Was it closed? Was there lighting?
There were benches and chairs, and that's all I remember. And there was light, not light, but it wasn't dark.
Was there a bathroom there?
I have no clue.
Do you remember being hungry down there?
No. It was mostly at night, during the night, so no.
Do you remember sleeping there?
Maybe I slept, my mother holding me. But no, and my mother, that I remember, she always said, don't be afraid. These are the good people that are, What did I know about the good and the bad? She said, these are the good people who are bombing. I don't remember her exact words, but she wanted me to understand that they were the good ones who were bombing Berlin. What I do remember, one occasion when my mother got very upset with my father, they were going to come to pick up all the silver, and which they did. But my father said, yeah, sure, they can have it all, but they're not going to get it in pristine shape. And he took the big coffee pot or teapot and sugar container and whatnot, put it on the floor and started stamping on it. And my mother got so upset. And that is way, way back in my head.
And how old were you then?
Probably 8.
8? Mm-hmm. I've never heard that one before. Wow. And when you say they, what did your father know about who they are?
He figured the Gestapo or,
Had he heard that people's homes were getting taken over by the Gestapos?
He must have. He must have. And I suppose at this time, this is something that I only found out about 15, 16 years ago. My parents owned a Cézanne, which I presume at that time, when the Nazis came, or maybe later, I have no clue when, but 16 years ago, I got a call from a lawyer from Berlin who, since the Germans, kept all the notes very meticulously, he found out that my father had bought the Cézanne, I don't know what year, but it was under his name, because when I heard him say lawyer and inheritance, I right away wanted him to contact my cousin in Monterey. I thought it had to do with my grandfather in Cologne, who I did know owned several buildings, and I said, I know nothing about him, get in touch with him. And he said, no, this is under the name August Brunel, nothing to do with your Uncle Eric.
Tell me about this Cézanne. Where is it now?
I wish I knew. I wish the lawyer would know, because if he would find it, he would get a nice amount of money of finder's fees.
What do you know about the last time it turned up?
At the time, he told me there were 3 similar ones, girl at the piano. And one was in the Hermitage, one belonged to a private collector, either in Australia or New Zealand, and the third, which obviously must have been my father's, God only knows where it is, if it still is.
So the one that's at the Hermitage in Russia was not your father's?
No.
The one that's in Australia is not your father's,
no.
But there's one that is missing.
Yes.
That belongs to your father.
Yes.
And was this a painting where the girl is at the piano, or you have no idea what's going on?
Most vaguely, I do remember in the room it hung.
Tell me about it.
The room was the first room to the right when you entered our apartment, which was like a second living room. And there was a piano, I'm not 100% sure, but more or less. And I think the painting hung on that wall. To describe it, I couldn't.
If your father packed things up for England, did he forget to pack that painting?
He didn't pack anything. The movers came and packed everything. Furniture. I have lists of what they packed. The other day I showed Carol. You can hardly read it, but everything is written down. Furniture, clothing, dishes, everything. Nothing about the painting, and the painting, I'm sure, the packers didn't pack.
How did they find you to let you know
The
that
lawyer,
you have this?
that was the first question I asked him. How did he find me? And it was a circuitous way with the name Brunel. He found somebody, Brunel, in New York, asked him about me. Then he found Brunel in Los Angeles, who gave him my phone number and my name.
This is amazing that an attorney contacted you and said, there's this painting that's out there, a Cezanne, Paul Cezanne, am I correct?
Yes.
And it was painted in the 1800s, I believe.
I suppose,
right?
Yeah.
Supposedly. And how would they know that your father and this painting are associated? Was there a piece of paper? I'm trying to understand it. Can you help me with that?
The lawyer, who, since the Germans kept such correct notes, this lawyer, it was his business, went to the offices where the Germans had written everything down, and in one of the books he found this Cezanne that belonged to my father, under my father's name.
Like the Nazis wrote, okay,
Yes.
the SS wrote, this Cezanne taken from this home.
Right. I imagine.
Wow.
I imagine, yeah. Because when he called, I tried to steer him to my cousin, and he said, no, it has to do with August Brunel, which of course was my father.
If you located this painting, what would you want to do with it?
Probably if we could afford insurance, I would give it to my son. Because ever since he heard that story, and he loves collecting art. And ever since that story, when he goes to a museum, he shoots a picture of a Picasso or whatever and says, I just bought it, you should get it in 2 months or so.
Wow. Have you seen a Cezanne? Did you see what they look like?
In museums, yes, of course. And I have a book. Carol gave me a big, beautiful Cezanne book. She said, since you don't have the painting, she gave it to me as a present some years ago. I have it here.
When you looked in the book, did you say, oh my gosh, that Cezanne was the one in my house?
No.
You have no recollection of what it would have looked like?
No. No, not really. And Carol, this time when she came to visit, brought me a Cézanne puzzle, 500 pieces, because in Chicago they just had a Cézanne exhibit where she went, didn't see Girl at the Piano, but brought me the Picasso puzzle, which we were supposed to work on. We haven't had a chance, haven't had time, but I will.
So you have two children. Tell me their names.
First, I'll tell you about my husband and how I met him.
I would love it.
Oh, and before that, I was able to finish high school.
Ah.
And what I would have really wanted to study was medicine. I always wanted to become a doctor. Obviously, that wasn't going to happen. However, when I finished high school, my mother's brother lived in Seattle, Washington, and they invited me to come and spend a year with them and say I would perfect my English, I would be able to go to school, not medical school, but and that's what I did. When I graduated in 1949, I left for Seattle and went to a technical school where I became a medical secretary. And instead of living with them for 1 year, I was there for 2 years. I met, they had one son who lived in New York at the time, but I met all of his friends, and I always associate the fact that I cannot remember names is because in one afternoon where he sort of made a little party to introduce me to his friends, and there must have been at least 20, he said, "This is Jerry, Henry, Paul, whatever," and I never remembered a single name. And whenever I met one of them, they knew my name because it was only one name to remember anyway. So after 2 years of studying there, first I worked in Seattle because I figured the studies alone are not good, I need some practice. And I worked at the University of Washington for the thoracic surgeon, who also was in charge of doing experiments on dogs. And with my poor memory, I do remember they were working on the left mitral valve on dogs. And I hurried with the paperwork for him in order to run upstairs and watch the surgery on the poor dogs. Anyway, my mother remarried during the time that I was in Seattle, so I didn't feel bad about not going back to Mexico. I did go back after that job, stayed in Mexico, even looked for work, but none of the doctors there hired a medical secretary. They all had like a servant who was literate and knew how to answer the phone, etc. And they really didn't need much more. In what was it by then, 48. So then I went to LA in case that I didn't like it. It was closer to Mexico, and worked for an otorhinolaryngologist there, Philip M. Rubin. A lot of his patients were Jewish, and I met them, and that was a lot of fun. Then I came back to Mexico, stayed there a short while, and then I went to New York where my aunt lived. My grandmother was still alive, but she died shortly after. But once I found a job for a urologist, I rented a room in one of those old buildings on Central Park West, and rented a room there and walked 2 blocks to the doctor's office, and his name will come to me in a short while.
How old are you at this time?
91. Well, in October, next month I'll be 91.
No. How old were you while this was going on in New York?
How old was I? 22.
You're 22. Okay, I didn't think you were 91.
Then, no. But anyway, while working for the urologist, I would visit my mother every year, more or less. And on what my husband would call my last vacation, or he would call it, I'm still on vacation. Anyway, when I went to Mexico in July, beginning of July 1954, there was a couple in Mexico. They loved my husband. They had met him and were always trying to fix him up with a nice Jewish girl. He was from New York. He had been in Mexico 7 years. So at one point they found out I was coming to Mexico on a visit, and promptly called my mother and said, would it be all right if Herbert called Ruth? And my mother said, sure. So yes, we had our first date and spent 3 hours talking. And after that, we went out every day because I only had 10 days vacation. But by more or less, I don't know, after a week, he proposed.
After a week?
And I said, how do you know you want to marry me? You haven't even kissed me. For all you know, I might have halitosis. But no, he kissed me. We got engaged. We called all the family in the States. His brother lived in Washington, D.C. He only had a brother. And we got engaged July 14th and got married September 12th, 1954. Same year.
Tell me about your wedding.
Well, first we went together to New York, because after all, I had all my clothes in New York. I had to say goodbye to the doctor, my aunt, uncle, etc., pick up my stuff, tell the people, Ellenbogen was the name with whom I lived, goodbye, and introduce Herb, and Herb introduced me to his aunts. Unfortunately, his father died while he was in the army. His mother passed away shortly before we met. But I met the sisters, and I met his brother and sister-in-law because we flew from Mexico to Washington. So I met the Washington family first. Then we were in New York. We went to the embassy there to say we were getting married. Did we need any special papers? They said nothing. And we came back to Mexico, didn't have much time to plan the wedding. But there wasn't much to plan. We didn't want a big wedding. My mother and stepfather lived in Cuernavaca in a beautiful house with a big garden, and it was going to be there, everything, the chuppah, the dinner, everything. September 12th, it never rains in Cuernavaca in September, but September 12, 1954, it rained. And my mother said, come on, get up, get dressed. And I said, no, I wait until it stops raining, which it never did. So quickly they had to move things around from the garden. Fortunately, the house had a covered long terrace and everything fit there. So there was the huppah, we got married there, and we didn't have to look for an apartment. Herb had his own apartment, Herbert Strauss, Herbert Milton Strauss. And we got married on September 12th, and on the 14th we left for our honeymoon, San Francisco, Los Angeles, and flew back to Mexico. And at the beginning, I lived in his apartment, and then we started looking for an apartment in the same neighborhood, which we found, and Carol was born there. We had 2 children, a daughter, Carol, and my son, Robert, who's 2 years younger.
Carol was born where?
In Mexico City, in the Spanish hospital, which was very near to where we lived.
And Robert too.
And Robert too.
And what did Herbert do? I love that name.
Herbert, I never called him Herbert. And the kids not either. And on his tombstone it says Herbie.
Herbie.
Everybody called him, well, in the family, everybody called him Herbie. Herb started working when he finished high school and would go to school, night school in New York. And with the war, he always said he won the lottery twice. The first time when his number was picked and he was drafted way before Pearl Harbor, and the second time when he met me. But anyway, he worked, at the time, he worked for a company called Roditi and Company. They were world traders, and when Herb came back, he was 5.5 years in the army. Salute.
Thank you. I have a note here that I wanted to ask you, and it said something about silver that was taken.
Oh, yes.
Could you explain that to me?
Well, the Gestapo came and they, took whatever valuables they found in the house you lived in. And as I say, the silver tray with the tea and whatever else, I don't know how many things, but I do remember my father stomping on it and my mother screaming at him or yelling at him and saying they're going to take you away too or something.
It wasn't silver coins, it was just the silver in the house.
Yes.
Okay, yes, you did tell me. Thank you for repeating that.
What did happen, now that you say coins, and my mother was even more hysterical at that time, my mother had some gold coins, which she had buried in a rubber plant. And I guess when we moved into the furnished apartments, I don't know, at one point she got hysterical. The Gestapo would come and look all around, would find these gold coins. So she took them out of the rubber plant and flushed them. And after she flushed them, she became more hysterical because she thought it's going to clog up the drain, and then they'll for sure come and get her or get us. That I remember.
Stop. What's interesting is when you told me about that your mother flushed the coins down the toilet, what I notice about you, dear Ruth, is that you move on. You don't look back at a past. You have a past, but what is interesting is that you personally found Herbie,
Yes,
2 children,
yes,
and then all of a sudden you have grandchildren. You're proud to say great grandchildren.
yes, 5 of them.
When Herbie was working, what was he doing? What was his line of work?
When he came out of the army,
Mm-hmm.
Roditi had kept his job, but then they asked him if he wanted to run their office in Mexico City, which they had just opened. So his mother had remarried, so Herb said, sure, new experience. He drove in December from New York to Mexico City without knowing a word of Spanish, which he obviously also learned very quickly. And unfortunately, that company that had been around for 40 years or longer went broke, and so that was the end of that job. But he liked Mexico and went to New York to a headhunter's office, and there the owner of a company, H. Steele, quite well known, needed a junior executive. So I don't know if Herb flew to Mexico to be interviewed or if Harry Still was still in New York and interviewed him. But anyway, he got that job and stayed with that company for at least 7 years. And then he started his own company.
With steel, right?
No. H. Steele was well known for watches.
Mm-hmm.
And when Herb started his company, because this is a funny coincidence, there was an elderly man by the name of Warschauer who was a very close friend of Uncle Eric. And he, when Uncle Eric wasn't able to travel to Veracruz or Manzanillo or wherever a ship with immigrants was coming, this Mr. Warschauer would go. They were very good, close friends. Mm-hmm. Mr. Warschauer was on in years, so he was looking for a partner, and Herb became his partner. And he sold home goods, television, refrigerators, watches also. And so also Mr. Warschauer died shortly after Herb became his partner, and only then found out that Mr. Warschauer had a number of debts. But Herb paid it and everyone to the last cent. So, and he stayed in that business until we moved to the States. He always knew that he was very happy in Mexico, living there, but he always said, once I retire, I want to move back to the States. And I had the choice of either moving back to New York or would I like to live in San Diego. Didn't take me very long to decide, and here I am.
Tell me about San Diego. What was your life? What is your life like in San Diego?
Well, when we got married, Herb the first few months was very unhappy. I was busy, of course, arranging the house, etc. But then Herb joined SCORE, Senior Corps of Retired Executives, except he would call it Senior Corps of Retarded Executives. And once he joined, he had a very good time because he was the only Spanish-speaking fellow in the group. And they really do wonderful work in helping businesses that aren't going well or new businesses that start with help and advice. And Herb did that from 3-4 months after we got here. And when it got very computerized, which he didn't like, then he was a volunteer with the police, the sheriffs that drive around. And he spent a lot of time in Balboa Park whenever they needed a Spanish-speaking person. Herb would go. And his favorite volunteer job was at the airport, where he got to drive the cart in the terminal for the people getting off the plane to the baggage claimant there. That was his favorite job. And when we moved here, he looked at all the possibilities that unfortunately none of them worked to be able to do that. So he was very unhappy until he volunteered to become, there is a gift shop here, to become and work twice a week in the gift shop, which he renamed like Little Costco, because they're very well, have all sorts of things. And then he was happy here at Secrets too. Unfortunately, that only lasted 10 months, and then he passed away.
You lived in Del Cerro, correct?
Yes, we lived in Del Cerro.
That's like being on the wing of an airplane, being able to look over the city.
It was a beautiful area. And
that's where you raised your family?
Carol lived very nearby. And yes, I got to see the grandchildren very often. And when Carol went back to school, we would pick them up from Hebrew school and take them for dinner. And we were in walking distance, so that was wonderful. My son lived in Atlanta. So I love my grandchildren, but, it wasn't the living together with when they were growing up.
What does Judaism mean to you today?
I believe there is an all-encompassing, if we want to call it God, something that created nature, that created us. And it is a way of living, a way of feeling and thinking, mainly.
And if you traded where I'm sitting with your grandchildren and your daughters, your daughter and son, what would you want to tell them right now?
That no matter what, they should always conserve a feeling for Judaism and keep it dear in their heart and mind.
Is there something that you wanted to do that you didn't do that you would
I
want
would
to
have
do?
wanted to study medicine, but fortunately, Carol's, my oldest granddaughter, went on to become a registered nurse. My son became a doctor. His youngest daughter is going to graduate next year as a physician's assistant. So I feel that my yearning for medicine has trickled down into the younger generations.
Do you know you just answered my question? That was the question I was going to ask you, and you answered it. That your children and your grandchildren, you were able to see the world of medicine through their eyes. Am I correct?
Yes.
Yeah, it's fantastic. Yes. Why don't you give me a lasting thought before we get into photographs? And I know there's somebody we're going to meet, which is your daughter. So if you have something you can tell me, that you can tell your family and you can tell us, I would really appreciate it.
Well, first of all, I want to compliment you, and I want it to be taped, that I dreaded this for a long time. I always felt how relieved I'll be after it's done. I might even feel sorry that it's over. So, no, I want to thank you very much. You made it very easy and meaningful.
All right, we'll set up and get some photos and your daughter.
We'll have to call her now.
So a lot of times people like to dedicate the interview to somebody. And I believe that you mentioned somebody called
Yeah.
The Zuse. Tell me about the Zuse.
When I was no longer able to play with my friend from across the street, she was wonderful. She was not Jewish and put her life, in danger by taking me to the theater or to a concert. So she was wonderful not only to me, but to my dad, who liked his chocolate and sweets, and she would always find some for him. But it went even further to the good friends of my parents whom she had met, who were in concentration camps. When she could, she would send them packages. And at one point, she showed me and gave me a postcard that she had received, thanking her for the package that she had sent. So she was an exceptional person.
So this one is dedicated to
the
Zuse.
Zuse. Yeah.
Thank you. Ruth, tell me about the people that are behind you.
This is my daughter, Carol, my firstborn, my most wonderful daughter, the most wonderful daughter any mother could wish for. And this is my, I won't even call him son-in-law because he's more like a son. He has been in the family for 50 years. I was fortunate enough in meeting his parents, and I couldn't wish for a better husband for my daughter than Phil is, and son to me.
Carol, what is it like having a mother like Ruth?
She's been a wonderful, wonderful mother. Unfortunately, we had a lapse as far as geography because I spent some years living in Israel and then in South Africa, but we finally reunited in San Diego and spent 30 somewhat years together, and she was the most wonderful mother and grandmother to my 2 children. And now it's a little bit difficult because we've got geography in the way again, but we speak at least twice a day. We check in with each other, and sometimes when I come here and I tell her she's got to throw out half the stuff in the refrigerator, I know she doesn't like it, so I'm trying to be a little kinder about it. But I love her dearly, and I would never have another mother.
And how do you love Mama-in-law?
Very, very much. Well, Ruth, as well as Herb, her late husband, my late father-in-law, were in many ways parents to me, because as Carol mentioned, we were in Israel. We met in Israel, we lived in Israel for a period of time, and then we had a short stint in South Africa prior to coming to the United States. So I was away from my parents ever since I was 24 years of age. And this is where Ruth and Herb really played a wonderful role of being parents, loving parents, and I couldn't be happier for that.
Thank you. Who is this?
That's my mother, and those pictures were taken in 1939, shortly before we left Berlin. Mostly passport pictures.
And who's in these pictures?
Those are my father's passport pictures, also taken in 1939.
How old was he?
He was, at the time, 40. He died 5 years after we arrived in Mexico, and he was 51. So he was a little over 40.
Who's this little girl?
That picture was taken in 1939 when I had my eye surgery, because I was very, very cross-eyed, and my mother had to beg the surgeon, who was also leaving Germany, to please do it, because once we left Berlin, probably we wouldn't have money, and she knew he would do a good job.
That's what. Who's in this picture? I believe he's your Superman.
Absolutely, that's the famous Uncle Eric, who not only saved us and his younger brother, my other uncle and wife, but 70 Jewish people who came on different boats to Mexico without a visa, and without him would have gone straight back to Germany and death. So he is a very special person, not only for us, but for all the people and descendants that are alive thanks to him.
Amen. Hit the picture, because it's going to go out. I love this picture. Tell me about what he's like now.
A marvelous sense of humor, very placid, very nice, very, very good, and philanthropic, and a wonderful person and family.
You can see that in his eyes. Beautiful picture. Thank you.